There's a box in your kitchen right now that contains more engineering than most people realize. It wasn't designed by a chef. It wasn't tested on families. It was perfected in a laboratory by people in white coats who never intended for you to eat just one serving. And you probably don't think about it anymore. In 1972, the average American consumed roughly 123 pounds of sugar per year. By 2005, that number had risen to 152 pounds. That's not because people suddenly developed a stronger sweet tooth. It's because sugar had quietly become the skeleton key of the food industry, a molecule that didn't just flavor food, but made it irresistible. The language changed first. Breakfast became breakfast cereal. Snack became snack food. These weren't just categories, they were economic sectors, and every sector needed growth. In the decades following World War II, food companies faced a strange problem. Americans were eating enough. The market was approaching saturation. You can only sell so much bread to someone who already has bread. So the question became, how do you make people eat more than they need? The answer wasn't found in kitchens. It was found in psychology labs, in regression analyses, in focus groups behind one-way mirrors. The food industry learned that the human brain doesn't just respond to taste. It responds to something called hedonic adaptation, the point at which pleasure stops increasing and the brain begins to feel neutral. The goal was to design foods that hit that pleasure threshold, but never quite satisfied. Foods that left you wanting more, not because you were still hungry, but because the experience wasn't complete. This wasn't an accident. It was a formula. Scientists called it the bliss point, the precise combination of sugar, salt, and fat that maximizes craving without triggering the body's natural stop signals. Entire departments were dedicated to finding it. And once they did, it was baked into everything. Yogurt, which had been a relatively plain, fermented dairy product, became a dessert. Bread turned sweet. Pasta sauce, traditionally made from tomatoes, olive oil, garlic, began to taste like something closer to ketchup. Even salad dressing, something ostensibly linked to health, became a delivery system for high-fructose corn syrup. The term ultra-processed wouldn't enter the academic lexicon until 2009, but the category had existed for decades. These were foods that didn't just contain additives, they were constructed from them. Ingredients you wouldn't find in a home kitchen. Ingredients that didn't spoil, didn't separate, didn't vary from batch to batch. They were engineered for shelf stability, not nutrition. Walk into any supermarket in the 1980s or 90s and you'd see it everywhere. Brightly colored boxes with cartoon mascots, foods shaped like things they weren't, snacks marketed as part of a complete breakfast that were in reality dessert. The phrase "fortified with vitamins" became a kind of semantic shield. If a product contains synthetic vitamins, it could be framed as nutritious, even if the base ingredients were sugar, refined flour, and soybean oil. Children became a target demographic, not in the sense of let's make healthy food appealing to kids, but in the sense of let's make kids the ones who decide what the family buys. Saturday morning television became a broadcast pipeline for sugar. Characters were created not to tell stories, but to sell cereal. The mascots had names, they had catchphrases, they had lore, and they worked. Parents, many of whom had grown up in the Great Depression or its shadow, were told that abundance was good, that feeding your children meant giving them access to as much food as they wanted. The idea of restriction felt old-fashioned, even cruel. So the boxes piled up in the pantry, the soda filled the fridge, the snack cakes went into lunchboxes. No one was lying exactly, but no one was telling the whole truth either. Before the rise of convenience foods, meals were built differently. Breakfast was eggs, toast, oatmeal. Lunch was leftovers, sandwiches made from real ingredients. Dinner was something cooked, usually from scratch, or at least assembled from recognizable components. Snacks existed, but they weren't a food group, they were occasional. Then came the shift. It happened gradually enough that no single generation noticed the entire arc, but if you compared what a family ate in 1950 to what they ate in 2000, the difference is structural. Meals didn't just get faster, they stopped being meals in the traditional sense. They became eating occasions, fuel stops, individual transactions between a person and a product. Cooking from scratch fell from roughly 75% of meals in the 70s to less than 60% by the 2000s. That might not sound dramatic, but it represented millions of daily decisions redirected away from raw ingredients and toward packages. The average household began spending more on food eaten outside the home than food cooked inside it. Drive-thrus became a weekly routine. Microwaves became essential appliances. The phrase, "What's for dinner?" started to mean, "What are we ordering?" or "What are we heating up?" The recipes people knew by heart began to fade. Grandmothers still had them, but they weren't always passed down. Cooking became something you did when you had time, not something you did because it was how you ate. And time, of course, was the thing everyone seemed to have less of. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the 70s and 80s. That was progress. That was necessary. But the food industry seized the moment, not to support working families, but to sell them solutions. The message was clear. You don't have time to cook, and that's okay, because we've done it for you. Just open the box. Just add water. Just microwave for 3 minutes. What they didn't say was what you were giving up. Meals used to be one of the few times a family sat together without distraction. The table was a place where children learned to wait, to share, to talk. Cooking was a skill passed from generation to generation, a form of cultural continuity. Food carried memory. A dish reminded you of a person, a place, a season. Ultra-processed foods have no memory. They taste the same in every state, in every season, in every decade. They're designed not to remind you of anything except the product itself. And because they're hyper-palatable, engineered to be more stimulating than anything found in nature, they began to replace the foods that required effort, attention, or patience. Vegetables became a side note. Fruit became something that came in a pouch. Meat became a shape, nugget, patty, strip. The average American child in the 2000s could identify hundreds of corporate logos, but couldn't name 10 vegetables. That wasn't a failure of education. It was a result of environment. And the environment had been redesigned. The body is not a machine, but it has certain rules. It evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to deal with scarcity, not abundance, to prioritize calorie-dense foods because they were rare, to crave salt and sugar and fat because they signaled survival. The modern food system learned to hijack those signals. In 1975, the average body mass index in the United States was in the normal range. By 2010, more than 1/3 of American adults were classified as obese. Childhood obesity, which had been almost negligible in the 60s, became a public health crisis. Type 2 diabetes, once called adult-onset diabetes, began appearing in teenagers. These weren't moral failings. They were biological responses to an environment that had fundamentally changed. When you eat an apple, your body has to break it down. The fiber slows digestion. The sugars are released gradually. Your brain gets a signal. You've eaten something. You feel satisfied. But when you drink apple juice, especially the kind that's been clarified, sweetened, and stripped of pulp, your body receives a flood of sugar with none of the braking mechanisms. The brain doesn't register fullness the same way. You can consume 5 apples worth of sugar in a few gulps and still feel like you haven't eaten. Now apply that principle to an entire diet. Ultra-processed foods are digested faster than whole foods. They spike blood sugar higher and crash it harder. They trigger dopamine release in the brain, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction pathways. And because they're less satiating, you eat more of them to feel full, which means you consume more calories without ever feeling satisfied. It's not about willpower, it's about design. The food industry knew this. Internal documents from major corporations, released years later through litigation, showed that companies conducted research into the addictive properties of their products. They knew that certain combinations of fat and sugar activated reward centers in the brain. They knew that heavy consumers of their products exhibited behaviors similar to substance dependence. And they used that knowledge not to reformulate, but to optimize. The result was a population that grew sicker, heavier, and more metabolically disturbed than any generation before it. Heart disease remained the leading cause of death, but its roots shifted. It wasn't just about cholesterol anymore. It was about insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, fatty liver disease, all conditions linked to high sugar intake and ultra-processed diets. And still, the message from the industry was it's your fault. You didn't exercise enough. You ate too much. You made bad choices. But you didn't design the choices. Someone else did. There's a specific kind of betrayal that comes from realizing something you trusted was never designed with your well-being in mind. Not overtly malicious, not poison, just optimized for a different goal. The brightly colored boxes in your childhood pantry weren't there because they were good for you. They were there because they were profitable. The commercials that played during your Saturday morning cartoons weren't about nutrition. They were about market share. The foods that filled your lunchbox, that your parents believed were giving you energy and vitamins, were doing something else entirely. They were teaching your brain to crave specific combinations of molecules that don't exist in nature. And none of this required a conspiracy, it just required incentives. Companies are legally obligated to maximize profit for shareholders. If a food scientist discovers that adding 2 more grams of sugar increases repeat purchases by 15%, that discovery gets implemented. If a marketing team finds that children who see a mascot 7 times are more likely to request a product, that mascot gets more airtime. If a formulation can be made cheaper by replacing butter with hydrogenated soybean oil, the switch gets made. No one needed to sit in a room and say, "Let's make people sick." They just needed to say, "Let's make this product more appealing than the competitors." And the effect of this, over decades, was a food supply that deviated greatly from what humans evolved to eat. By the time the science caught up, by the time researchers began publishing studies on the metabolic effects of ultra-processed foods, on the gut microbiome disruptions caused by emulsifiers, on the neurological impacts of chronic sugar consumption, the damage was embedded, not just in bodies, but in culture, in taste preferences, in what felt normal. You can't recall a food you never tasted. You can't miss a skill you were never taught. If you grew up in a home where dinner came from a drive-thru, where snacks meant opening a package, where cooking meant reheating, then that's not neglect. That's just what food was. But it wasn't always. There are people now who are trying to reverse it, who are learning to cook again, reading labels, avoiding the center aisles of the supermarket, who are teaching their children that food can be slow, that it can involve waiting, that it doesn't always come in a box with a mascot. But it's hard to unlearn something that was painted as normal for 50 years. The system didn't break by accident. It was built this way, And what was built can be understood. What was designed can be redesigned. But first, you have to see it for what it was. This was just one chapter. There are others.